Senator from New York is recognized.
Request that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
I want to begin by taking this opportunity to thank the chairwoman of the Agriculture Committee and the ranking member for their very, very strong efforts in getting this bill to the floor today. Their steady hand of leadership has made vast improvements for America's agricultural community and our economy as a whole. And I know that the tireless efforts of our chairwoman and her staff undoubtedly leave America's foreign policy in a stronger position than when she found it. And I know she's worked with a forward-looking vision for a thriving agricultural economy and rural community. I also want to thank the chairwoman and the ranking member for working with me and all the members of our committee throughout the process that got us here today. And because of this strong work, I'm urging my colleagues to vote for cloture on the motion to proceed to this bill. When I first came to the Senate 3 years ago, I became the first member from my state of New York to serve on the Senate Agricultural Committee in almost 4 decades. And it's a responsibility that I not only honor, but I take incredibly seriously. And for those 3 years, I've traveled all across our great state. I've met with our farmers in their communities. I've listened to their concerns. I understand their needs and the priorities. Now, New York is not home to the mega corporate farms. We're home to small dairy farms, specialty crops, orchards, and vineyards. And as we've been shaping and debating this farm bill, those are the farms, the small businesses that I've been fighting for. Now, I am very grateful that this bill will help our specialty crop growers by providing them with dedicated funding stream as well as a better way to protect against disasters. And I'm also very proud of the good work with broadband investments to make sure that our rural communities have access to the Internet. We also worked hard on trying to guarantee more transparency and accountability in how we price milk in this country. But we cannot forget that this bill is much more than a number of esoteric figures. What a farm bill is about, it's about how we protect and create a growing economy for small businesses, agricultural businesses, the middle class, and those families that are desperately trying to get there. The Farm Bill is about the health of the agricultural industry. It's about the health of our families with nutritious food that's actually within reach of the children who need it. So as a mother, I am very concerned that this current Farm Bill cuts $4.5 billion from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's the SNAP program, food stamps as we know it, over the next 10 years. Now, I'm incredibly disappointed and even troubled that my Republican colleagues are seeking to cut food stamps even more from those cuts. Now, under this bill, families in New York who are already struggling will lose $90 a month of food that goes onto their tables. Now, think of a month long of food for a family. It's basically the last week. The last week, a family will not have enough food to feed their children. Now, $90 a month may not seem like a lot of money to some people. But I can tell you, if you are a parent who's trying to protect your children and feed them good, wholesome, nutritious foods, it means everything in the world. Now, I don't know for any parent who's watching today whether you personally ever heard your child say, "Mommy, I'm still hungry." Well, imagine not being able to help your child and feed your child. Imagine that your child says this every single day. That is what we are faced with here. I've heard stories from New Yorkers who never dreamed they would need food stamps in their lifetime, who never imagined that they would have no choice but to apply for this kind of federal assistance. I heard from one single mom in Queens. She had a job in the supermarket, but she still struggled to make ends meet. And she broke down in tears one day when her son came home from school with his school lunch in his hand and said, "Mommy, I brought this home for us for dinner, and I asked my friend for his sandwich." Another woman in Brooklyn, incredibly well educated, went to a prestigious university but lost her job. She said, I never thought I would be asking for food stamps, but suddenly I was jobless. I didn't know where my next meal would come from. Food stamps played a big role during make-or-break moments in my life. They're not a handout. I worked all my life, I paid my taxes, and food stamps helped me get back on my feet again. As a mother, as a lawmaker, watching a child go hungry is something I will not stand for. In this day and age, in a country as rich as America is, it is unacceptable and should not be tolerated and should certainly not be advocated for. I know that not every state in this country has as many as we have in New York. We have 20 million people in our great state. So with these cuts, it's going to affect 300,000 families. Imagine 300,000 families in your state or any state going hungry at night. These kind of cuts, they hurt children, they hurt families, they hurt seniors that are homebound, seniors that don't know where their next meal is going to come from. We are asking these families, these 300,000 families, to take a disproportionate amount of the burden. They were not the cause of the financial collapse. They were not the cause of this terrible economy, but we are asking them to bear the burden. Now, we know food stamps are actually a very effective investment. For every dollar you put into the food stamp program, you get $1.71 of spending back into the economy. Mark Zandi, world-famous economist, says the fastest way to infuse money into the economy is by expanding SNAP and food stamps. This money pays the salary of grocery clerks, truckers, bringing food to and from a store from the farm. The USDA estimates that 16 cents of every one of these food stamp dollars go right back to our farmers. And despite widespread myths and inaccuracies, there is so little fraud in the SNAP program, less than 1%. That's a penny on a dollar. Now, I take our nation's debt and deficit as seriously as anyone else in this chamber. And I applaud the chairwoman and the ranking member for being able to curb spending. But families who are living in poverty, who are just trying to figure out how to keep the lights on and put food on the table, they did not spend this nation into debt, and we should not be trying to balance the budget on their backs. Subsidies for large corporations that don't need it, companies based in Bermuda, Australia, Switzerland, it's not the right priority for America. We should be helping the most needy among us, our children, our seniors, our family at risk. So today I'm introducing an amendment to restore the $4.5 billion in cuts because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for our families, our seniors, our kids. It's the right thing to do for our economy. It invests $500 million over 10 years in fresh fruits and fresh vegetables, a SNAP program which connects our kids to our farmers. It gives the authority to the Secretary of Agriculture to make additional purchases as part of the Emergency Food Assistance Program. It's useful when we have all-time high rates of hunger and unemployment that put unbelievable demands onto these emergency feeding organizations. And to pay for these investments in our children's health and health of the economy, my amendment makes a very modest reduction in government subsidies to some of the most highly profitable companies. My amendment lowers the subsidies to companies from billions per year to hundreds of millions per year. Anyone who argues that these companies will struggle from this shift needs to meet a family who is dependent on food stamps to feed their children. As I said earlier, this farm bill, like all legislation, it's about our priorities. It's a reflection of our values. So I'm asking my colleagues, let's agree that children deserve healthy meals so they can live healthy lives, so they can learn, so they can grow, so they can reach their God-given potential. Let's agree that it's a worthwhile investment in our future to make sure that children do not go hungry in this country. I yield back my time, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Montana is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that two detailees from my office, Herrick Fox and Benjamin Thomas, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the debate on S-3240, the Agriculture Reform, Food and Jobs Act of 2012.
Without objection.
Abraham Lincoln was no stranger to agriculture. He spent most of his early years on farms. Many years later, he signed into law legislation that created the Department of Agriculture, which just recently celebrated its 150th anniversary. President Lincoln understood American agriculture. He said, "The man who produces a good full crop will scarcely let any part of it go to waste. He will keep up the enclosure about it and allow neither man nor beast to trespass upon it. He will gather it in due season and store it in perfect security. Thus he labors with satisfaction and saves himself the whole fruit of his labor." End quote. Those timeless words ring true today, and they will ring true tomorrow. American farmers and ranchers are the most productive and efficient in the world. Their hard work creates good-paying jobs in Montana and across the nation. In fact, 1 in 5 Montana jobs are tied to agriculture. But President Lincoln's observations also apply to many other walks of life, including work in the United States Senate. Under the leadership of Chairwoman Stabenow and Ranking Member Roberts, we have cultivated a farm bill for tomorrow. We must not let that hard work go to waste. They worked very hard, very closely together, cooperating. It's a good farm bill. This legislation achieves what many thought impossible. It creates a market-oriented safety net that works for American farmers, strengthens crop insurance, and streamlines conservation programs, while still contributing $23.6 billion to deficit reduction. That's right, This reduces the deficit by about $23.6 billion. That's over 10 years. Direct payments have their place in the farm program history, but in light of necessary spending reductions, it was clear that we could not continue the status quo. So, the Senate Agriculture Committee worked closely with farmers and ranchers across the country to create a program for a real safety net, one that only pays farmers who actually experience a loss. Farming is an extremely capital-intensive industry, and our farmers often work with paper-thin profit margins. Even the best farmer is left at the mercy of chance. Historic droughts, catastrophic floods, price collapses, and so much more. This new revenue program will make sure there is stability and predictability for our farmers from year to year. Our comprehensive farm policy contributes to overall security in American agriculture, and that's why we spend less on food than any other country in the world. Americans spend less than 7% of their disposable income to feed their families, 7%, compared with almost 25% in 1930. But it's more than just food security. As a net exporter of agricultural products, Montana farmers and ranchers create good-paying jobs and, quite literally, grow wealth and prosperity from our fertile soils. The shallow loss revenue program, combined with the same crop insurance products that we have fine-tuned over the decades, creates a fiscally sound safety net. This is the fruit of our labor, and we must keep this intact. And we improved much more than just the commodity title. We saved $6 billion in the conservation title without compromising the policy. We did this by consolidating 23 existing programs, consolidating them all together, creating a tight network of efficient and streamlined conservation programs. And I made sure that we protected the working lands programs, which contribute to substantial conservation improvements but still allow for productive use of the land. For livestock, I made sure that we extended and made permanent the livestock disaster programs that I worked hard to include in the last Farm Bill. Since they were created in 2008, the 3 livestock programs have helped over 100,000 ranchers across the country. Right now, we are experiencing historic droughts in regions of the U.S. that also produce much of our beef. The livestock disaster programs will help those ranchers stay in business until rain starts falling again. In the forestry title, we permanently authorized stewardship contracting. This is very important. This will help the timber industry sustainably harvest more trees. This permanent authority is critical for reducing wildfire risk and maintaining resilient landscapes and communities throughout our country. As I advocated prior to markup, these returns are well worth small investments. It can keep companies like F.H. Stoltz, which has celebrated 100 years in operation in Columbia Falls, Montana, in business for another 100 years. I also was pleased with the inclusion of a workable approach to the bark beetle epidemic spreading throughout Montana and the West. My colleague from Montana, Sarah Tester, has also worked to remedy this epidemic. Our loggers and small timber mills in Montana are facing the second worst beetle kill in the lower 48. A Forest Service tied up in lawsuits and a housing market that continues to drag. Sawmills like those owned by YR Timber in Townsend and Livingston will benefit from the approach we take in this Farm Bill. I was also very proud of the work the committee did for veteran farmers and ranchers. Not only did the committee accept my amendment to expand access to conservation programs to veterans, but also will direct USDA to set up a military liaison position. These strides to extend assistance to veteran farmers and ranchers are vital to returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who hope to return to rural America and become involved in agriculture. 45% of those who serve in the military come from rural communities. The Farm Bill provision makes it clear that both efficient authorities and adequate resources are crucial for this effort, and I'm committed to enacting legislation that enables the decisive and responsible action that's urgently needed. There's a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about creating jobs and cutting debt. The Farm Bill is our jobs bill. It's also responsible to taxpayers. If we senators were farmers, I would say we have produced a pretty good crop with this bill. But that is not the final step. All farmers know that there is a time for harvest. Now is harvest time. It is time to pass this farm bill. If we wait too long, we run the risk of compromising the stability of American agriculture and of our food supply. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the opposite before me.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
On the other side of the Capitol, today the House is finishing work on the energy and water spending bill for fiscal year 2013. They're voting on amendments right now. You can see it on C-SPAN. On C-SPAN 3, in about 15 minutes, we'll have live coverage of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on corruption in Afghanistan. And today in the Senate, they are working on the Farm Bill. The current bill expires in September. We spoke to a reporter about it.
It's a about to tackle a major reauthorization of farm, food, and nutrition programs. Kelsey Snell with the National Journal Daily. Tell us about some of the major issues that will come up during this debate.
Well, I think the first thing that we're going to want to be looking at is the big reform that they're pitching in this bill is the shift away from direct payments to a shallow loss program, which is more of a risk management system. Some say it's a great way to save money. They estimate that this bill itself saves about $23.6 billion. But there's a pushback from some of the southern farmers, particularly people growing rice and peanuts, who would prefer to stick to the direct payment system.
Tell us about some of the key players we'll see on the floor during the debate.
Well, most of the floor debates can be run by Senator Debbie Stabenow. She's the chairwoman of the Senate Agriculture Committee. She's going to be very active, and she personally has taken a lot of control of this bill. I think you're also going to see, a pretty wide cast of characters because the Farm Bill really touches a lot of members of Congress. Just about everybody has a reason to have a stake in this, particularly a lot of senators. It's a very senior committee, the Agriculture Committee. Got a lot of high-up people like even Senator Max Baucus is going to be involved. You'll see the pushback will probably come from people led by Saxby Chambliss, and you'll see some efforts to coalesce around an amendment from Kirsten Gillibrand around food stamps. So I think that's probably the most likely active people you'll see.
What in particular is it about food stamps that will get their attention in the debate on this bill?
Well, one of the things that I think is often forgotten about the Farm Bill is that it really is a food bill. It covers more than just people growing fruits and vegetables and commodity crops. It also covers food assistance, the SNAP program. And this bill particularly cuts about $4 billion from that program. There are cuts all over the board, but there's about $4 billion in cuts just now. They say that, Senator Stabenow says that the majority of the cuts are going to come from narrowing administrative costs and waste, fraud, and abuse, but the fact of the matter is it is being used more and more during the recession. Food stamps are, and there's some concern that any cut to the program could be a big loss for people in need at the moment.
We're reading in National Journal and elsewhere that this debate is going to take several weeks. Why is that?
Well, it's because it is a huge bill. It's enormous. It's about $969 billion, and it is a great opportunity for amendments. And there are already dozens and dozens pouring in, and they don't have to be germane to the bill itself. So we could see people bringing in immigration amendments. We could see people bringing in abortion amendments. And even when they narrow it down to those that are germane, there are a lot of issues about growing food and about farms that could really slow this down. And the debate on those will take a long time.
Are we going to see debate on a farm bill in the House anytime soon?
Well, that's a really good question. The hope is that, Chairman Lucas on the House Ag Committee has said that he sees the opportunity, this Senate vote is an opportunity to kind of move things forward in the House, but there's a lot of question if there's enough pressure on leadership in the House to actually bring this to the floor. I'm sure we'll see something reported out of committee, but it's really an open question about whether or not it'll actually get to the House floor.
There's a lot facing Congress this summer. What's the timetable for getting this to the President?
Well, it does expire, I believe, in September, and when it expires, the Farm Bill doesn't go away completely. It just reverts back to the laws passed in the 30s and 40s, which would be very difficult for farmers. So ideally, most members agree that they want to get something done this summer, but summer is jam-packed, like you said. So it's tentatively that they need to get something done by the end of July to have a really good prospect of going to committee and resolving issues between the two bills.
Kelsey Snell is with National Journal Daily. Thank you for the update.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings in the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you. And further, Mr. President, to speak as if in morning business for up to 12 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Let me speak today about two recent CBO reports and what they portend for the economy and for policy that we might want to be making here in the Congress. CBO, of course, is the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. And from time to time, it looks at economic conditions and presents studies or issues reports about the state of our economy based upon legislation that the Congress has adopted. And there are two recent reports which I think suggest some very dire news for this country unless we're willing here in the Congress to take some action. The first was a couple of weeks ago, and it dealt with the so-called fiscal cliff, the problem that will occur with the combination of two things automatically happening unless Congress and the President act. The first is the automatic across-the-board cuts or sequestration that will affect both defense and non-defense spending to the tune of $109 billion next year, something which the Secretary of Defense has said would be devastating and catastrophic for our national security. That's the first problem. And what the Congressional Budget Office said was that the combination of the sequestration with the second item, which is the automatic tax increase, which is a $4.5 trillion tax increase that begins on January 1st, the combination of those two things will put this country back into recession, with the growth rate next year, CBO projected to be only about 0.5%. And that, of course, is devastating for not just the economy, but for job creation, for businesses, for families, and the like. The second recent report of the CBO just came out, and it is a report that talks about the surging debt of the United States government and talks about the probability of sudden fiscal crises. So we have a combination here of the potential for going back into recession combined with the probability of sudden fiscal crises because of the amount of debt that the federal government is taking on. Now, because of this second report just came out, let me refer to some things that have been said about that, primarily in the Wall Street Journal in a piece on June 5th called Obama's Debt Boom. And I'll just quote a few lines from this editorial in the Wall Street Journal. It says that the CBO's long-term budget outlook notes that federal debt held by the public, and that's the part we have to pay back, will surge to 70% of the economy by the end of this year, which is the highest in the history of the country except during World War II. I think that's about $49,000 or $50,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. And they point out that under the present trend, the debt will hit 90% of GDP by 2022, and then balloons to 109% by 2026. Now, what does this mean in practical terms? Well, here's a quotation from the Wall Street Journal about the CBO projections. Quote, "We have never been deficit scolds, preferring to focus on the more important policy priorities of economic growth and spending restraint. But the Obama era is taking America to a place it has never been. Inside of a decade, the country will have a debt-to-GDP ratio well into the 90 to 100% danger zone, where economists say the economy begins to slow and risks mount." And CBO notes that this level of debt increases, and I'm quoting now, increases the probability of a sudden fiscal crisis during which investors would lose confidence in the government's ability to manage its budget, and the government would thereby lose its ability to borrow at affordable rates. End of quotation. How bad is it, the Wall Street Journal asks? Well, in the absolute worst-case scenario, CBO says that debt would exceed 250% of GDP in 2035. At that point, again quoting, the CBO's economic model breaks because so much debt is so far outside historical experience, and the CBO's assumptions might no longer be valid. End of quotation. That's where we're headed if we don't do something about it. And interestingly, what the CBO assumed in order to reach these conclusions is that tax collections would continue to hold to the post-1972 historical average of 18% of GDP. So the point here is we're not talking about raising taxes in order to affect this. They're assuming that we will have revenues of the historical level of 18% of GDP. The problem is not the tax collections, in other words. The problem is the excess spending. And they go on to point out that, of course, the excess spending is primarily a factor of the entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And they point out that the biggest of all of those is in Medicare. And then Wall Street Journal concludes this way. This is where the tax burden comes in. And on that score, CBO admits, quote, to the extent that additional tax revenues were generated by boosting marginal tax rates, this is what President Obama has proposed, remember, those higher tax rates would discourage people from working and saving, further reducing output and income, end of quote. So even the so-called Keynesians would admit that there are costs in lower growth if we raise tax rate as the President has proposed. This is, in effect, the most predictable crisis in history. So you have the combination of the CBO report talking about the fiscal cliff, what happens if both the sequestration and the automatic tax increases go into effect, combined with the most recent report about the debt, and you can see that the United States is headed for a disaster without intervention by the United States Congress and the President. Just one last thing. The director of CBO put it this way, and I quote, "The explosive path of federal debt underscores the need for large and timely policy changes to put the federal government on a sustainable fiscal course." So what has the President and the Democratic majority here in the Senate suggested? Well, we turn to Jay Carney, who had a press conference Monday. He's the spokesman for the President. And he said the President, I'm quoting, is continuing to work with his team on potential new ideas. Well, I'd like for him to be able to work with the Congress, because we've had a lot of ideas here. The House of Representatives has passed almost 30 bills that deal with this. They range all the way from the Keystone Pipeline, which immediately puts 20,000 people to work, easing environmental regulations, offshore oil exploration, and so on. So we'd love to have him work here with the Congress rather than this anemic to-do list that he has proposed, which obviously wouldn't provide any relief. Bottom line here is that as was reported in a story by the Associated Press, Andrew Taylor, of a day ago, I think, as he said, after talking about the bills passed by the House of Representatives, he said, and I'm quoting, "Democrats will try to stop Republicans from forcing a vote on it in the Senate." And the "it" that he's talking about is the vote the House of Representatives intends to have here before long that would extend the current tax code so that there's certainty in tax rates and businesses and families don't have to worry about this $4.5 trillion tax increase. But Democrats will try to stop Republicans from forcing a vote on it in the Senate. Why? Why would the Democratic leader here not want to have a vote on whether to extend the current tax rates as opposed to having an increase in taxes of $4.5 trillion? Actually, there are a lot of folks, leaders in the President's party, people who have worked with him, who have said it would be a good idea to extend those tax cuts. And in fact, the President himself said so when he extended them for 2 years, along with the support from Congress, in December a year ago. He said not to do so would harm economic growth. And he was exactly right then, and he's right now. As a matter of fact, we had a better GDP growth back then than we do now. And if that would have been harmful back then, a fortiori, it would be more harmful now. Well, he has his belief then is adhered to by people who have worked with him and former leaders. For example, former Democratic President Bill Clinton suggested yesterday, that Congress temporarily extend all of the Bush-era tax cuts And that includes the tax cuts for the wealthy. Remember, the Bush tax cuts applied across the board. They applied to everybody. And the president has said, well, that's fine, but not for the wealthy. And what President Clinton said, no, the best thing for the economy would be for all of those tax cuts to be extended. And I'll quote what the former president said. What I think we need to do is to find some way to avoid the fiscal cliff, to avoid doing anything that would contract the economy now. And he was asked if that meant extending the tax cuts, and he said, quote, they will probably have to be put off until early next year. That's probably the best thing to do for right now. And then the president's former advisor, who is an economics professor, Larry Summers, said today that Congress should temporarily extend the Bush-era tax cuts. He said, and I quote, the real risk to this economy is on the side of slowdown, and that means we've got to make sure that we don't take gasoline out of the tank at the end of this year. He mentioned this on MSNBC's Morning Joe program, and he said, quote, that's got to be the top priority. So here you have Larry Summers, former advisor to President Clinton on economic matters, and former President Bill Clinton, both of whom have said that we need to extend these tax policies today in order to avoid further damage to our economy tomorrow. Exactly what the President himself had said when these tax rates were extended a year and a half ago. And I just note from another Associated Press story regarding the comments by President Clinton, as they say, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and others have warned that letting both events occur, that is to say the sequestration and the automatic tax increases, would suck so much out of the economy that it could spark a renewed recession next year. And that's when they refer to the statement of President Clinton that we need to find a way to avoid that fiscal cliff, and that would include extending the tax cuts. Now, Mr. President, the reality is that we have somewhat of a consensus beginning to develop here that it would be a wise thing for the country to retain current tax policy, not allow this big tax increase, to avoid the sequester or the across-the-board cuts that otherwise would affect both defense and non-defense, and that if we don't do those two things, according to CBO, the nonpartisan office that advises the Congress, we are likely to go back into a recession with growth that would be only 0.5% for our GDP next year. Let me just conclude by referring to another article in the Wall Street Journal dated June 5th, title of which is Defense Chiefs Signal Job Cuts. Now, here what we're talking about are the employers of people in the defense industries who are predicting that if we don't do something about sequester, that they're going to have to begin laying people off. And the article begins with this quotation: U.S. defense contractors are preparing to disclose mass job cutbacks ahead of November elections if Congress fails to reach a deficit reduction deal by then, industry officials said. One of the people quoted is Robert Stevens, who's chairman of Lockheed Martin, which is a very big contractor with the Defense Department, as you know. And he said, and I quote, "It is quite possible that we will need to notify employees in the September and October time frame that they may or may not have a job in January, depending on whether sequestration does or doesn't take effect." And one of the reasons for this is a federal law that requires employers to provide this notice. It's called the Worker Adjustment and Retaining and Notification Act, known as the WARN Act, and it requires companies to notify employees in advance of mass layoffs or plant closings if you have more than 50 or more employees, for example. And one thing that Mr. Stevens said is that it doesn't just affect the companies, the big companies like his, but also all of these suppliers, the people who have to provide the pieces or the components of products that they end up then putting together. And they would have to be notified because they're not going to have subcontracts next year. So one of the industry officials said sequestration is already here. And the reason, what he meant by that is that the reality is that businesses are having to make decisions now. So this talk here in the Senate about we'll somehow be able to deal with this in the lame duck session after the election is simply not true. And I would just suggest to my colleagues in both the House and Senate, if we try to wait until after the election, I think our constituents, knowing what's happening here, are going to, and some of whom will have probably gotten job notices that they may be subject to termination because of the automatic across-the-board cuts known as sequester. I think that they may be sending a message to us this fall, and therefore it behooves us to act before rather than after the fact. Now, there's been talk today about what the Wisconsin recall election meant. I think one thing it must have meant is that people may complain about some of the decisions that are made when they are tough decisions, but they want people who are elected to political office to do something about the problems, to act, to have some courage, to tackle the tough problems. And even if they don't totally agree with the solutions, I think they respect political leaders who are willing to do that. Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, took a lot of heat, but at least he had taken the bull by the horns, tried to solve a problem, and as a result of the things that they were able to do there, the fiscal situation in the state of Wisconsin is much better than had they not taken those actions. I think that's what we here in the Congress need to learn. The people understand that we have a big debt crisis facing us, confirmed by the Congressional Budget Office. They understand that there is a huge risk of another recession because of the twin problems of the biggest tax increase in the history of the country coming our way on January 1st and this sequestration that also occurs on January 1st. They'd like for us to do something about it. And I think what they really resent is politicians saying, well, after the election, we'll take it up and begin thinking about it. First of all, that's too late for a lot of people whose jobs depend upon it, and makes for a very inefficient way of running the government. And secondly, I think political leaders owe their constituents the ideas that they would like to put into effect. You don't wait and hide the ball from your constituents, refusing to tell them what you think until after the election. The whole idea of a democratic republic is that people stand for office by saying, this is what I would do to solve our problems. Do you like it or not? And if the voters say, yeah, we think that's a pretty good idea, then they elect you, and then they expect you to follow through on it. If they don't like your ideas, then they elect the other person. But if you hide the ball and say, we're not going to take any votes here in the Senate because we don't want to put our members on record, because then the voters might know what they're thinking, and they might not like it, and then they might not elect them, well, that's obviously a lack of political courage. But it also runs counter to what the whole concept of elections is all about. So I suggest that what we'd ought to be doing is tackling these two issues now, not wait until after the election. Now, legislation has been introduced in both the House and in the Senate to find a way to save the $109 billion that needs to be saved in order to avoid the sequester for next year. This process will have to be undertaken every year for the next 10 years because we promised the voters that we would save a total of $1.2 trillion. So how will we do it next year? Well, there are any number of ways. Senator McCain and Ayotte and myself and Chambliss and Graham and Cornyn and some others have introduced legislation that says, well, here's a way you can save the $109 billion next year, get half of it by simply extending the President's own pay freeze for many federal employees through the middle of 2014, and the other half, instead of replacing every single federal worker who retires or leaves the federal workforce, only replace 2 out of the 3. Everybody talks about how wonderful the recommendations of the Simpson-Bowles Commission were. Well, the Simpson-Bowles Commission recommended hiring 1 new federal employee for every 3 who leave the workplace. We double that. We say, well, let's hire 2 of the 3 back. The combination of just those 2 things would result in saving $109 billion. Now, if you don't like that way to save money, there are many, many other ways to do so. And there are revenues from the sale of federal property, for example, that could also be put on the table. So there are many ways to do this. Let's get about it. Why aren't we doing it? Well, the majority leader and the President say the only reason, or the only way that they would consider doing this is if we also raise a bunch of taxes. And their wonderful idea about raising taxes is a tax on millionaires. And here's the problem with that. The very people that you want to create the jobs are the business people who pay these taxes. According to President Obama's Secretary of Treasury, that department says that 80% of the people who would be subject to this millionaire's tax are business owners, the very people who need the money to hire the workers to put the economy back in good shape. When Senator Lindsey Graham asked Defense Secretary Panetta, wouldn't this be, the sequestration be like shooting ourselves in the foot? He said, no, Senator, it would be like shooting ourselves in the head. And I submit that raising taxes on the exact people who you're looking to create jobs is the same thing. And that's the reason that Republicans have said that's the wrong way to come up with this $109 billion. The whole idea from the Budget Control Act was to control spending, not to raise taxes. And since there are so many ways in which this government, plus $3 trillion plus budget, can save money, I don't think we have to turn to something that would itself have a negative impact on economic growth, namely raising taxes. So that's been the reason why this hasn't been taken up. One side insists we've got to raise taxes in order to deal with the sequestration problem. The other side says, no, we don't. We don't have to do that at all. Let's sit down, let's work together, and let's find a resolution to this problem. And let's get it done before the end of the year, because at that point it's too late for a lot of people who will have lost their jobs. By the way, some of these industry people also told us that some of the sole source suppliers or subcontractors would probably end up taking bankruptcy because their orders could not be filled because there would be no certainty that the contract was there. So you could have a great deal of damage to the economy. In fact, the estimate is that if sequestration or across-the-board cuts occur, in the defense industry alone, you're talking about 1 million jobs lost. Now, you remember how many jobs were created last month? I think it was 69,000 jobs created last month. Compare that to losing 1 million jobs, and you can see the significance of what the Congressional Budget Office was talking about. This is a fiscal cliff. You cannot allow the sequestration to occur, and you cannot allow these big tax increases to occur without understanding the damage that that's going to do to the economy. It's going to put us back in recession, they said. And that's before the report that they just released on the increasing debt burden of this country. So, Mr. President, I just urge my colleagues, the evidence is here. And leaders like former President Clinton, economist Larry Summers, and of course many other economists have said the best thing to do is to keep the tax rates where they are, don't raise them, resolve this sequestration issue so that we don't have that hanging over our heads, and then look for other ways to boost job growth and economic productivity. That's the way to get out of the recession. That's the way to help families. And ironically, at the end of the day, a growing economy producing more wealth produces more tax revenues for the federal government. And that helps us deal with the big debt that we've accumulated. So I think everybody agrees that economic growth is ultimately the best way to get out of the government's fiscal problem, but it also, of course, is precisely the way for businesses and families to prosper. I hope that colleagues in both the House and Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, can see their way to respond to this crisis, this utterly predictable crisis, and to deal with this problem sooner rather than later, exercising the courage that our constituents would like to have us exercise, and thereby represent them in the way that they deserve to be represented. Mr. President, I note the absence of quorum.
The clerk call the roll of the Senate.
Mr. Akaka.